Welcome everybody! Today in a Flash I'll be discussing shutter speed. Shutter speed is the duration of time the sensor is exposed when the shutter mechanism is triggered. The amount of light that hits a camera sensor is directly proportional to the shutter speed. If the shutter speed drops by half, the amount of light the sensor sees is dropped by half as well. Reducing the amount of light that the sensor is exposed to by half reduces the exposure by a stop. Because shutter speed is directly proportional to the exposure, the inverse is true. Doubling the shutter speed doubles the light exposure on the sensor, increasing the light seen by the camera by one stop. All light that is projected on a camera sensor while it is being exposed is captured. If something on the scene changes while the sensor is exposed, that information is captured in addition to all the information at the beginning of the exposure. Movement during this exposure comes in one of two forms: motion blur or camera shake. Motion blur is when something in the scene changes while the sensor is exposed. For instance, if your subject moves position. Camera shake is the movement of the framing of the scene while it is being exposed. Oftentimes, you are not just trying to compensate for either motion blur or camera shake, but both at the same time. One way to compensate for motion blur is to pan with your subject. If you maintain your subject in the same position in the frame while it is moving, your subject will be in focus while the other areas of the photo will be blurred. Panning is simple in principle, but difficult in execution, requiring a steady hand and smooth, even movements with your subject. The other method of compensating for motion blur is to use a faster shutter speed. Using a faster shutter speed gives the scene less time to change while the sensor is exposed. Above a certain shutter speed, your subject will be moving slower than your shutter is moving, thus freezing the action. Here are some common shutter speeds for capturing different activities. While these are common shutter speeds, there is not a rule of what speed to use and when. You, as a photographer, are charged with using a shutter speed that complements your composition. To compensate for camera shake, we use the reciprocal rule. The reciprocal rule states that the shutter speed you use while hand-holding a camera should be faster than the reciprocal of the focal length. For instance, if you are using a 100mm lens, the minimum shutter speed to eliminate camera shake is 1/100th of a second. If you are performing exposure of 1 second or longer, it is recommended that you use a tripod. In closing, shutter speed is proportional to exposure. The longer the time that your camera sensor is exposed, the more light for the camera to collect. Shutter speed affects your image sharpness in two ways, whether it be motion blur or camera shake. We compensate for motion blur and camera shake by increasing our shutter speed. An additional technique to compensate for a slow shutter speed is to pan with your subject. To eliminate camera shake while hand-holding your camera, use the reciprocal rule. Our next topic in this series is going to be aperture. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe for future content. Thank you all. My name is Kevin Armentrout, and this was In a Flash.